At first glance, HBO's lavish new historical drama, The Gilded Age, is about rivals between old money and new money in 1880s New York. But the series has an unusual twist that has Black Twitter ablaze. The series follows the Scott family, a prominent Black family from Brooklyn, New York. Today, I'm talking to experts about what HBO gets right about Black history and why the series makes for perfect Black History Month binge TV watching. All coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Julian Fellowes is considered one of TV's preeminent writers of fictional dramas centered on British aristocrats, but he is in uncharted territory with the Gilded Age. See, this isn't about Great Britain. It's about wealthy families who are living in neighboring mansions on Fifth Avenue in New York City in the 1880s. The two families represent opposing forces in New York society. The old money Van Ryans, who proudly tout their revolutionary roots, and the nouveau riche Russell families, who are determined to use their railroad fortune to conquer Manhattan society. But in an unusual twist for this kind of society tale, The Gilded Age follows Peggy Scott, a Black woman who is from a prominent Black family from Brooklyn, New York. Peggy is an aspiring writer who works as a secretary for Miss Agnes Van Ryan. Fellows admits that he had no idea there was a prosperous upper middle class Black community in New York towards the end of the 19th century, and that community wasn't based in Harlem. Now, how common were families like the Scotts, and why has the series taken on such significance in the world of pop culture and beyond? Here for my lead-off discussion is Dr. Treva Lindsey. She is a professor of African American women's history at Ohio State University, and she is the author of several books, including her most recent, American Gotham: Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice. The book hits the bookstands April of this year. Welcome back, Dr. Lindsey. So glad to have your expertise on this subject. I just want to start by asking you, give us the simplest definition of what is the Gilded Age?
So the Gilded Age is this period typically marked by like 1870 to right at the turn of into the 20th century that demarcates this incredible growth that's happening, economic growth, mobility growth. There's an extreme push towards wealth and the creation of wealth and the leisure that comes out of this era that's coming out of the Civil War, that's coming out of emancipation, that's also seeing the influx of immigrants from around the world, particularly from Europe, that's happening. And so the Gilded Age is a way to think about the frivolity, the joy, the leisure, the accumulation, but also all of the labor that took place to make that possible in the United States' long history of the late 19th into the early 20th century.
So when we look at this HBO series, the sets are incredibly lavish. Everything's extravagant. The household staff for these two wealthy, kind of dueling families, one staff, it looks like, 20 people or so who are working for this family. That's only 4 people, a mother, a father, a son, and a daughter, but it looks like there are 20 or so folks who work for them, cook, clean, and attend to every little detail. Is there anything unusual about the way this is cast, or is that the way a wealthy family would have lived during this Gilded Age?
Yes, so the Gilded Age, our new guilty pleasure on television in a lot of ways. What I really appreciate about this show thus far is its accuracy, is its attention to detail, that this is something that we're starting to see, these multi-millionaire kind of families accumulating wealth and creating lifestyles that show that we have this wealth exhibition. So you see that in the staffing, you see that in the ornate details and the set design, the production design, the rivalries between families. This is very much so part of that moment, because the competition to remain in this elite status and to make sure that your elite status is solidified, is confirmed, is very much so visible in the way that you show up in the world through opulence, through engagement, through how many people labor for you. And you have to pay this labor now, right? Even if you're underpaying them and certainly still exploiting that labor, that this is a new moment in which now we create a real wealth stratification that we start to see in even more extreme ways.
Well, yeah, you're right. It's our new guilty pleasure, because just the costumes alone are so fascinating. But here's what caught my attention, and I think the attention of Black Twitter and so many other culture critics, is this stunning story about Black families in Brooklyn, New York during this time. I was stunned, I think as a lot of people were, to learn that there were Black families outside of Harlem. So we've always studied about the Black intelligentsia in Harlem. But here we are now in this series focusing on a Black family in Brooklyn. So talk about what it would have been like for Black families living in Brooklyn, New York during this period.
Right. So one thing we have to think about is that New York gets a certain kind of primacy when we think about this era of the Black elite. But the Black elite and the emergent Black middle class, because these are people who are coming out of slavery too, but also people who have histories and generations of being freed people. And so you need Black businesses, you need Black stories, you need Black communities that are concentrating wealth in particular ways. So for a Black family that's living in Brooklyn at this time, who's creating this kind of enclave and world that's still moving through a virulently racist world, we tend to think that that's only the U.S. South where that's present. But of course, we know that there's incredible violence that is part of New York's history as well, and particularly around lynchings and racial violence that emerge in relationship to the Civil War and people being sent to fight for the Union Army. So Black people are targets in this moment. So you're coming out of that and really trying to establish yourself post-Reconstruction. What is this going to look like for Black New Yorkers? So it does mean these community spaces. It means these families that are trying to establish themselves amidst a white supremacist world, amidst a world that's still questioning what is going to be the role of Black people, and then the class stratification that exists among Black people even in this moment. So you have extraordinary poverty, but you also have Black folks who are becoming 100,000aires, millionaires during this period as well.
Well, you talked about stratification. We see the Scott family, which is the main family that's featured in the series, and they live in this beautiful brownstone, but they also have an African-American maid, cook, servant. I don't know what the right title would be, but we see a Black woman serving this Black family dinner and working in this house. Was that common to see Black people working for other Black people during this period?
Yeah, common in that particular circle, right? So common amidst the Black elite that we see in Washington, D.C., that we see in New York, that we see in the Carolinas, in these emergent Black middle class, upper middle class, and wealthier communities. It is common that those who are in service to those are other Black people within those communities. It's interesting, another film recently, Passing, on Netflix, actually showed this dynamic as well of this family who also had folks working for them who were also Black people. And so those class dynamics emerged really early in the post-Civil War moment. They existed prior to that, but usually along the line of freed people, enslaved, more established generations of freed people. And then post-slavery, that emergence of class stratification among Black communities becomes even more blaring.
Yeah, so let's talk about the main character, Peggy Scott. She is this aspiring writer. She becomes a secretary for one of these wealthy families. Again, Peggy, I was reading that the writer said she is not based on any one character, but she's kind of an amalgamation of many women that existed during that time. So again, how common would it have been for there to be an educated woman like Peggy who had her own career ambitions, not tied to her father or a husband?
Mhm. Yeah, she's still somewhat exceptional, but it is not uncommon. That's a weird kind of tension there, right? That there are these Black elite women who are now college educated. So you have women who attended places like Oberlin, my alma mater, which is the first school, continuously running school that had an open admissions policy. So if you were a Black woman in the 19th century who got a college degree, chances are you went to Oberlin, right? So many of our historically Black colleges and universities are being founded during this period. Places like Howard University,
Mhm.
Feldman, Biz Tuskegee, these are being founded, but you have one established like Oberlin. And so you have Black women who are folks like Mary Church Terrell and Anna Julia Cooper, who Fannie Barrier Williams are highly educated. I mean, exceeding the education of a lot of white people in this era who speak multiple languages, who are traveling, who are very well versed and would be considered cultured by that time standards who are there. And so that character to me in many ways is bringing in those really intricate histories of thinking about these dynamic Black women who had access and resources, but also were pushing themselves and getting more and more and trying to create a path in a world that was decidedly racist and sexist. So they're up against two barriers, formidable barriers in terms of actualizing their full potential.
So we know Peggy has this friendship with Marion, who's the main character, the niece of one of the wealthy families. How likely was it that you would have had an African American woman becoming friends? And the show is very careful about making sure that the friendship is one of mutual respect and trust. They have Marion, in fact, borrowing money from Peggy. They have Marion being embarrassed and showing vulnerability around Peggy in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect during this period. You would expect Marion to be somewhat superior, have this kind of privileged attitude, but the show is very careful to try to create them as equals. Would that have been true, or is this fictionalized?
A little from column A and a little from column B. There are absolutely interracial friendships that are happening and dynamics where the power isn't quite, the imbalance of power isn't quite as stark. Again, some of this is showing us this very sensationalized for television version of this, but it is still rooted in historical facts that these kinds of relationships would have existed. They existed in circles advocating for women's suffrage. They existed in circles and longstanding things from abolitionist traditions. They existed because of common interests around temperance or other kinds of movements that are happening. But it is still an extraordinarily segregated society and segregated world. So those who are moving between those worlds have to be really careful and have to invest in levels of trust and vulnerability because there is considerable risk in those kinds of relationships, particularly for Black people investing in those. Because I'm waiting to see how this relationship plays out over this. I know it's already been renewed for a second season. So I'm curious to see if they're going to dive into some of those landmines that interracial friendships among women across the color line would encounter in the late 19th century.
Yeah, it's interesting to see how much power, how much authority, how much agency they're going to allow Peggy to have, particularly as Marion herself is kind of finding her way in this new society and having to find herself and wanting to herself be independent in a way that this society isn't really accepting as it relates to young women. So it is going to be interesting to see what happens with their relationship. Another really important, I think, piece of the storyline that's emerging is the prevalence and power of the Black press. So we actually get introduced to this historical figure who is actually considered the dean of Black journalism. Tell us again, what would have been the significance of the Black press during this period?
The Black press is everything. Black life and culture is covered in everything from society balls to lynchings that are happening to antagonisms to debates that are happening among Black and within Black communities. It is the site where it all happens. If you want to understand the pulse of Black life and culture, you need to look at your local Black newspaper. So it's the Washington Bee, it's the Pittsburgh Courier, it's the New York Amsterdam. It is all of these different papers that emerge in the late 19th and early 20th century that capture everything. They're capturing Black beauty culture, they're capturing commerce in Black communities. And so there's an intimacy to it, but also a way of exposing just how pervasive anti-Black racism is. And it also is a place for showcasing what many consider the best of the race, right? There's some investment in showing, look at all of these accomplishments that Black people have made in these various locales. And so the Black press is an incredible figure, both for political reasons, for intimate reasons, and for community building reasons. And that remains intact for a number of decades that we see the importance of that. And to this day, we still think about places like Essence and Ebony, digital platforms that have been created for Black life. And so the Black press is this home space, but it also counteracts some of the narratives that you would get in the predominantly white outlets that exist that might cover a racist incident and say, this broke down and this violence and only highlight white people who were harmed. The Black press is going to give you these numbers. They're going to call it a riot. They're going to call it a lynching. They're going to call a spade in ways that are really important for understanding. And so when you're looking back at history, it's so important to look at the press from this era to see the intricacies of what's happening, the nuances of what was happening.
So the writer-creator, British writer and creator, said that he relied heavily on Carla Peterson's book, Carla, who wrote Black Gotham, because she chronicles her own family's history of being a part of this Black affluent class in New York. So we have that book by Peterson, but I think one of the things that's so striking about this whole storyline is that how little has been written in history books and how little this period of Black influence, power is talked about, is taught about. Why do you think that is? Why isn't more known about this narrative from this period? Because when you think about this period, the traditional narrative is the slave narrative. It's the narrative of Black oppression. But this is such a difference, diametrically opposite. Father owns a pharmacy, father, family, mother is a musician, beautiful brownstone, power and affluence in this community, but not very well known.
Yes, I think it is certainly less well known. I think that we still tend to think about African American history in very siloed kind of ways. There's slavery, there's Jim Crow, civil rights movement, and then our contemporary moment. And we know there's so many depths and contours that get erased if we do that. And there's simultaneous things that are happening. There are businesses being built during slavery by Black folks, right? There's incredible work that's happening there. I think people often worry about what it means to talk about these opulent moments or these moments of wealth creation, et cetera, alongside the extraordinary violence that most Black people would have been encountering, right? And so what I often advocate for in this is these parallel histories, right? That we talk about all of these histories, a more expansive view of the late 19th century. So in one moment, it is the extraordinary violence, the founding of the Ku Klux Klan, the end of Reconstruction, the intensifying of racial violence and Black codes and the codifying of Jim Crow. It's also where we see people who are finding their way, building the businesses that need to be in communities because there's segregation, they won't have access. So you have to have cleaners and morticians and insurance companies and general stores. And so that history and these long legacies of Black communities who are able to create institutions and institution build, that also happens in this period as well. And so it is a both and as opposed to an either or approach to history.
And this show is happening in the late 1800s, and we know in 1883, the Supreme Court, U.S. Supreme Court, ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which allowed segregation, which allowed integration of public spaces, actually was ruled unconstitutional.
Right.
Therefore, forbidding the mixing of the races in public places like hotels and restaurants. So there is a scene where the family, well, I guess it's the dad and Peggy, are having the conversation on the streets in one of the episodes, and a white couple walks by. And there's this brief moment of like the white couple looking at Peggy and her dad like, you know, you better move off the sidewalk to give me the right of way. And they calmly move back. There's this kind of exchange with the eyes, and then they resume their conversation. But it's a reminder, I guess, that they are in this period where even though they have their affluence, they have their power, they have their stature, there is still white supremacy.
Absolutely. And I love the subtlety of that moment because it is the everydayness of it. We often think about the most spectacular examples of white supremacist violence. So you do think of lynching, you do think of sexual violence, you think of cities being burned down, communities being burned down. And yes, that is happening, but it's much more of this know your place thing. So you know those exchanges and that look meant, you know you need to move because the racial hierarchy, the racial order that has been designated in this period is still very much so intact. And so public space is demarcated in that way where you need to move because whiteness and white people are moving towards you. But that moment meant so much because it's not disavowing the reality of what was on the other side of that had they not performed accordingly, right? And appropriately and according to the racial status quo of that time. But it shows you the everyday indignities that Black people endured under a white supremacist regime.
I was reading something that said Black historians that write about this period that's being described as the Gilded Age don't refer to it as the Gilded Age. Can you speak to that? And how do Black historians refer to it?
Yes, some of us are like the long 19th century. Some of us think about it as the progressive era. Some of us talk about it as the nadir because of these laws, these codes that are happening, the extraordinary uptick in racial violence that's happening and referring to that. And so the Gilded Age, when I heard that, I was like, it's a very kind of white framing of this era and who's accumulating wealth and at the expense of whom. But it also means Black people are engaged in that framing as well. But I think that progressive era, the new woman era is one way of thinking about that, how women were viewing themselves. I've often thought about it, the long new Negro period that happens in here, articulate that because you have Black women in as early as the 1880s and 90s talking about being new women and entering into the modern world in certain ways in this post-slavery moment. And so thinking about themselves anew. And so that progressive era, that nadir, these again are these coterminous, coextant ways of looking at the world.
So during this period, you talk about the Black women who are prominent during this period. Ida B. Wells, would she be one of them? Of course. Is C.J. Walker in this period?
So we're coming up on this period, the development of that more towards the kind of turn of the 20th century, but this turn of the 20th century womanhood. But it is that Mary Church Terrell. There are a lot of people who are being educated, who are being raised in this period, who are seeing possibility. And that is part of this kind of Gilded Age sensibility of possibility, of imagination. What can we create? So with dormant practices, Black beauty culture really starts to explode in the last kind of decade of the 19th century and just is on a whole other level by the time we get to the 20th century and have someone like a Madam C.J. Walker or Annie Tarbell Malone. You have these madams that are popping up, and the madam was this way of asserting status in this industry and expertise that you see among that. That's part of that new woman period. And this is where historians, we struggle with how we identify these moments, because to make these clear demarcations means we have to periodize in a way that often doesn't attend to the subtleties and the nuances of how people were living their lives. They wouldn't see themselves in this period. They kind of see themselves in this longer arc of post-emancipation, post-Reconstruction, and what does that look like? And depending on your orientation to that.
What was the response or the reception that these Black affluent business owners, entrepreneurs received from what I'll just call regular everyday Black folks living in this period? Because I would imagine that this percentage-wise, how large of a group are we talking about? Is this 1% of the Black population, 10%? Give us some sense of the size.
Yeah, it's less than 10%. I mean, it's truly not a large amount. When we're talking about truly affluent, right? There is this slowly burgeoning kind of class that's not wholly impoverished. But for the majority of African Americans coming out of this period, they're just out of slavery or one generation out of. So the accumulation is much slower and still residual to this day. We can have these conversations about the residual impacts of slavery and Jim Crow on the accumulation of Black wealth. But this small percentage is very powerful. They're represented in the press. There's a way that their experiences and their stories are talked about in certain ways that when we look back, they definitely have an outsized representation.
So how are the 90% of other African Americans, is there kinship with these folks? Is there admiration? Is there resentment? Hostility?
It is all of those things, right? There's variation. Right? There's absolutely people who are celebrating and it becomes aspirational, this lifting as we climb kind of ethos that's connecting communities both ways, right? So folks who are elite, who are like, we need to make sure we're working with and alongside our brothers and sisters who don't have what we have. There are those who want nothing to do with it, want nothing to do with poor people, that might blemish their otherwise access that they have to certain resources and other kinds of communities. And then those are somewhere in the middle with this, who are a little bit resentful, but also aspirational. And so you see a multitude of responses from Black communities to this formation of the Black elite.
Mm-hmm. And how organized, was there a business league, association? How organized were these business owners and entrepreneurs?
They're absolutely business leagues. So the late 19th century, we organize, right? We have groups, we have communities, we have support systems, we have networks. Some are interstate, most are local, but these are forming. This is saying we need this kind of support. So these communal energies are needed for sustaining businesses, for creating opportunities. So you do see this push towards some kind of collectivity and network that emerges in this period as well.
What do you think, Dr. Lindsey, the biggest takeaway? You're right, it's going to be a second season, so we don't know where this series is going to go. We don't know where the storylines of Peggy Scott, her parents, maybe there's a love interest for Peggy, maybe there's a book, a novel in her future, lots of possibilities for the storyline. But what do you think the biggest takeaway so far should be from the series?
That set designer needs a raise, number one. But number two, that, Black life at the turn of the 20th century and the last part of the 19th century is complex. That there are numerous stories that we still have not told, that warrant being told, and warrant the kind of historical excavation and deep dive that unfurls in this kind of way, that we get a character like Peggy, that we get a character who challenges our assumptions about previous eras, but also confirms certain things about, like we said, those daily indignities that Black people experience. Because when we only see the spectacular, we miss the ways that white supremacy is interwoven into the very fabric of society. So I'm very appreciative of the way this series is approaching the daily, which allows for us to really grapple with the gravity of white supremacy at the turn of the 20th century.
So I think the takeaway is watch all of the scenes carefully and closely, because there's some little nuances that occur that are going to key you into what the real historical period was like. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lindsey, for sharing your insights, for helping us think about the series, its historical importance, and then have a way to appreciate those scenes that I think just clue us into both the power and the struggles that so many were dealing with during this really extravagant period in U.S. history. Extravagant. So again, always good to see you, my friend. Be well.
Thank you. Take care.
Okay. All right, now my next guest, Dr. Anna Everett. She's a professor emeritus of film and television at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and she's the author of multiple books, including Returning the Gaze, a genealogy of Black film criticism from 1990 to 1994. 1949, I'm sorry. And also joining me is Reggie Ponder. He is a Chicago-based film critic, radio talk show host, writer, all-around expert on everything TV and film, and a returning guest to the special report. Good morning, Dr. Everett, and good morning, Reggie.
Good morning, good morning, good morning.
All right, Dr. Lindsey gave us a way to think about this series from a historical standpoint. Now let's talk about it from just a purely television watching, what this means to have these Black actors and actresses grace the TV screens in this really important, I think really important period piece. I'll start with you, Dr. Everett. Peggy. Peggy is played by Denée Benton, a darker skinned Black woman. How important is it that Peggy is darker skinned Black woman rather than your fair skinned, light skinned, bright, light woman like me? So let's just call it what it is.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for that question. And the conversation between yourself and Dr. Lindsey was so important because you set up that historical reality on which the film, the series is trading, while the exuberance, and the exaggerations that the fictional element brings to bear. But your point about the colorism and the fact of these producers, I think that the fellows, Richardson Wilkinson collaboration really do a great job of making the case that dark-skinned Black women of the period really were the kind of dominant hue, as it were. But in film and television, we're not used to seeing them as lead characters, certainly not as beautiful, being dark-skinned, certainly not as romantic leads with sexual, romantic, agency. So I do think that thanks to Julie Dash and Daughters of the Dust, who really begin, that reevaluation of Blackness and Black women's beauty is so important. So I really appreciated the fact that, not only does this film really sort of highlight and accentuate, the fact that European beauty standards, but Black beauty is also crucial, to this representation, and representation matters.
No, absolutely. I'm so glad. And not just Peggy, but we just saw the picture of Peggy's mom, Audra McDonald, too, a darker skinned Black woman. So we have two women represented in this series that we don't typically see as leads, as you said, and also as women of means, of stature, affluent, powerful. Typically, if you are a darker skinned woman in this period, you would be a servant, you would be a maid, you would be a slave, you would be someone, part of the tropes that are typically played out in these types of period pieces. Reggie, I know you probably read this like I did, that both Denée Benton and Audra McDonald had reservations when they were approached about doing the series. They both thought, don't know, another period piece. Am I going to be a maid? Do I want to be a quota? Why is it today in 2020 that Black actresses, as accomplished as these two are, would still have to go through that thinking process when they get a call about a series like this?
Well, I love I too love the conversation that you had with Dr. Lindsey. And one of the terms Dr. Lindsey gave was parallel histories. What we have failed to do generally in media as it relates to Black people is to talk about or show those parallel histories. So if they're missing, you're thinking right away that you're going to show the one that you've been showing. And so do I have to be that part? It is so important. If I say nothing else today, it's so important to talk about parallel histories. You ask so many questions, and every time she says yes, and both of those things are happening. And that is so true, because as Black people, we have diversity within the diversity. We have misery among our successes. But what happens a lot of times is we want to just show the misery part. And I believe that those two actors were saying, do I have to go through that again? Do I have to see that again? And I think that that's the reason.
Yeah, and Dr. Everett, what I also have discovered in researching the series is it wasn't as as progressive, what we're seeing right now, that took evolution. That was a process that started happening because of the pandemic, shut down the production. And during the shutdown of the production, George Floyd was murdered. There was the protest movement that followed George Floyd's murder. Danae Benton wrote a very powerful letter about what she wanted the storyline to look like. So help us understand what might have happened had all of those things not happened.
That is such an important addendum, to this story. And it is something that happens as a result of, like you said, doing your research, because, even I was looking at some of the trailers, and I do know that, first of all, I did want to sort of circle back to what Reggie was saying about the parallel histories. I think one of the things that sort of leads us to what you were just asking is this issue of not only, the fact that we aren't often shown Black stories, but we're not even shown stories of the heterogeneity, the way in which Black people are not a monolith, right? And so I think what's so crucial is how the film kind of embarks on, the fact you mentioned, the Black elite and, what W.B.E. Du Bois sort of talks about as the talented 10th, which is actually an idea that was coined by a white, progressive, who is the namesake for Morehouse College. And so this idea of this top 10% of educated Blacks who really do sort of, create this, Black racial uplift narrative and agenda, for this period is so important. But I think to get back to this idea of what would have happened had we not had this kind of lockdown, this global racial reckoning that really changes a lot of people's attitudes, and all of these promises that are being made by corporations who want to sort of do the right thing now that there's this global anti-Blackness resistance to that, and this real desire to kind of see a change. I do think that the script could have likely been a little more traditional, and likely not been as progressive and focusing as much on Peggy's story. So just one other thing I wanted to say, you had mentioned in your earlier discussion, about Black Twitter and, this binging and this whole, kind of discourse about the Gilded Age. It reminds me of what I think is so powerful about this series. And it's sort of a combination of Downton Abbey meets Bridgerton, right? And so I also love the fact that Dr. Lindsey said, give that set decorator a raise. I mean, the opulence, it's such a visual, spectacle, to engage. And, we love all of that. But I think you're absolutely right. I do think that there could have been a tendency for the story not to have addressed with the kind of robustness, this idea of, Black progress and this missing history. And then finally, what Julian Fellows said in, sort of in one of the trailers, talking about coming together. And, that he really knew that he wanted to tell an American story, and you can't tell an American story the way you tell Downton Abbey, because you got to have Black folks. I mean, even Downton Abbey had this Black musician thing for a minute, but, you can't tell an American story without the Black story, right? And so fortunately, he did, consult with a Black scholar who's one of the co-executive, producers and writer, and, Sally Richardson Whitfield herself, because, without that, this could have easily gone off the rails. Okay. I mean, let's just be, like you said, let's just be real. But, so I do think that it was so important for this time of lockdown for people to kind of rethink some of their assumptions, go back and do a deep dive in Black history of this progressive post-Reconstruction era.
Yeah, you talk about going off the rail. I read a piece, Reggie, that said there was a dilemma. How were Peggy and Marion going to meet, and how were they going to get Peggy into the house of the Ryans? And the initial suggestion was that Peggy was going to pretend to be the domestic servant to Marion. So that would have fallen into those traditional tropes about Black women being servants, maids, etc. but it was because Sally Richardson and Sonia it has been brought on, and the Black scholar from Rutgers, the professor. Now you have all these voices, and you have Danae Benton. So help us understand why that would have been so typical, and we may have seen a Gilded Age with Peggy being the domestic servant.
It's interesting because Fellows does say that, well, it was going to be the entry point into getting her into the house, but it wasn't going to be the arc of her story. Okay, maybe. She gets into the house, but when she talks about this, when Benton talks about this, she says that once you change how she gets into the house, you change everything. You change the clothes. You guys are talking about the clothes, and I'm sitting here watching, and I'm like, oh, that's hot. Oh, that's bad. And her clothes are as cold. Oh, can I use colloquialisms? But anyway,
yeah, talk about it. Speak on it.
But they're as fly as all the other clothes that you see out there. There was this one of Greenpeace that she had on. I was like, oh my goodness, it is fabulous. So the fact that there was someone saying, maybe this is not the right way to go. I agree with Dr. Everett, is that it might have taken the traditional way. They might not have had the family built out the same way that they built it out, because Audrey McDonald was concerned about that. But would they have built it out the exact same way? I personally don't think so. So I think it's for the better. The couple of things that I do want to mention is that we talk about, you talked about the hue of Peggy in this piece. And we know even today, because we had a piece where I was on and we talked about colorism, is that I've been watching all of Black History Month, and I'm telling you that light-skinned, curly hair, frizzled hair woman is the woman that they're showing us. They're showing us from a love perspective that it's a Black man with a white woman or a light-skinned woman. And so this is so important, because what we see is that we see a Black man and a woman together. Now we don't see their love yet because they're on in age. So the things that I want to see in season 2 are things I do want to see. Black love. Will Peggy have Black love? I'm not mad at where they are. I'm just saying, as we progress, those will be some of the things that I look for. The last thing I just want to mention is that there's this criticism about the pain. Where is the pain? How come we don't see this great misery and pain that we normally see in Black life? Because we know it's there. Dr. Lindsey placed it in history, so we know that the pain was there when we're coming straight out of slavery. But I'm happy that they focus on the success without focusing on the triumphs. I mean, the challenges. That doesn't mean they don't show the challenges. When we see the success, we see that she has money, she dresses well, she's educated, and she has a well-to-do family. But we do see the challenges. We see what happens on that scene where you talk about on the street.
Right.
We see what happens when she can't use her name, can't write under her name.
Right.
We see what happens to her when she walks into Bloomingdale's. So they show it, they just don't focus on it. Thank you.
Yeah, no, you're right. It's there. When they go to see Barton, the Red Cross speech, the woman whose husband has committed suicide is giving Peggy the side eye the whole time. Who is she? Why is she here? So the prejudice, the racism, the discrimination, it's all there, but it's not the focus. And you know what? It's okay. It is okay to celebrate this period that is not talked about, that's not taught in schools, that's not written about nearly enough, because we know we can turn on the television, turn on a streaming site and get 12 Years a Slave and get any number of those movies and series that chronicle that pain. It's there. So it's not an either or. Let's make it inclusive and include all of the stories. And to your point about a love life, what do you think, Dr. Everett? I think when Peggy went into the Globe and that little cutie who's the executive editor of the paper, I thought there was some chemistry happening in that scene. Was that me making that up, or what do you think?
I love the fact that you sort of zeroed in on that. And, also Reggie's point too about, the celebration of this film of, Black women's beauty, dark-skinned Black women's beauty, right? But I do think that that's a perfect, kind of way to suggest the next season, right? It gives you something to look forward to, because there's clearly some sparks going on when she walks into the room, and, the Black publisher, who I think is, based on the actual publisher of the New York Age,
Yes.
and so you can see that they, do, because that newspaper was an actual Black newspaper.
Yes.
And so I do think that they hint and they suggest at that romantic liaison to come. But I also think what is important is that they also tease us with Peggy's backstory and the frustration and the problem existing between her dad about this young man. Because remember, one of the things that I liked, but also feel a little ambivalent about, was in the last episode where Marion is, interested in this guy and is kissing her, and Peggy walks in and sort of interrupts this potential problem, of this romance outside of marriage and the likelihood of scandal. So she kind of prevents Marion from making that romantic mistake, because it's implied that Peggy actually made a mistake like that, right? So she even says that, one of the problems with her father is that she fell in love with this man who changed her life. So I do think that they are going to find a love connection.
What are you ambivalent about? What about that scene bothered you?
Oh, so what bothered me a little bit was the knowingness about sexuality that Peggy has,
Okay.
but Marion is virginal
Innocent.
and
Yes.
innocent, and so there's a little bit of a kind of, for me, ill at ease that it's got to be the Black woman who's knowledgeable about sexuality, suggesting, some kind of maybe fastness, right? In terms of her sexuality. But that was just for a second,
It's so interesting that you say that, because now that you say that, of course, that is the case, that Peggy is painted as someone who had a relationship with the stock boy. We don't know how far it went, if they actually had sexual intercourse or if they just kissed. She said she loved him, so we know it was something. But I saw that scene as the show is purposely trying not to fall into these tropes of a white savior, of making Marion a white savior. So I thought that was a perfect way to show that here you have Peggy having to save Marion rather than Marion having to save Peggy. And there are lots of instances where Peggy, whether it's loaning her money to get on the train,
right,
where Peggy has superiority. She has more agency, she has more influence. And in that scene, I thought it was she has more wisdom, and she knew, I better interrupt this because this can go too far. But yes, I think your point is legitimate too. What about you, Reggie? What did you see in that part where Peggy interrupts the kiss that could have turned into him getting into the room and them, creating this huge scandal?
So I love this conversation, because I read some of the same articles that you read, and some of those articles talked about the criticism of Amos and Andy, and talked about the criticism of the Cosby Show. And then we see Dr. Everett saying, well, wait a minute, I got a little bit of criticism about that scene. What it means something bigger than just, I'm watching that particular show. What it really means is that because we don't see the totality of our lives, everything is under scrutiny. Everything, how you walk, how you dress, how you talk. If you were the one, but if we had seen something before where there were Black women who had agency from a sexual perspective, that might not bother us. Right. But because we want one show, I'm talking about in general, I'm not talking about Dr. Everett, I'm talking about Blacks in general. We generally want one show to have it all. please have the good looking Black man, make sure that there's some diversity in the way in which from a hue perspective, make the Black woman independent, make the man love the Black woman. I mean, we want it all in one shot. We can't have it like that. What we really need is we need shows like this that challenge the status quo.
Right.
The reason people felt that Cosby wasn't a real show is because we didn't know that this actual show right here, that this happened in Brooklyn, that there were doctors and lawyers and tech wizards and architects and all that type of stuff. Because if we had seen that before, and I know Cosby is not in vogue these days, but I'm speaking to the article that they were talking about. But if we had seen this, we were like, oh, okay, yeah, that makes some sense. Having a doctor and a lawyer or is not so far-fetched. So I really love this show for kind of backtracking and saying, hey, wait a minute, we missed a part of our history, and this part of our history is true. So I'm not as ambivalent as Dr. Everett on that piece, but I understand why Dr. Everett is there.
You know, and it's interesting because Dr. Everett, you said that you thought this was a cross between Downton Abbey and Bridgerton. And I'm thinking back to some of the criticism about Bridgerton and Reggae, you know, the star Black guy.
Right.
I'm blinking on his name. What's his name?
Reggae John.
Yes. Okay.
John.
So remember, part of the criticism about Reggae was he was always naked. And there were all of those explicit sexual scenes. And again, why does the Black man have to play into the masculine, over-sexualized trope? So that was the critique of some that we heard, you know, as Bridgerton was reaching its peak popularity. Do you think that this show in any way is kind of the counter? When Sally Richardson and Sonia Warfield come on board, do you think they're thinking about that critique?
Oh, that's a really good question. And while I can't obviously respond to that directly, I do think that your inference is so provocative because you know, for me, it's like, it's not so much, my ambivalence was just that, you know, there have been instances of this, this, you know, Black women's, you know, knowingness about sexuality, you know, before, and it's the Imitation of Life, the 1930s version, where Freddie Washington is passing, you know, as this, well, she's passing, right, for white. And Louise Beavers, who's the mother, is giving Claudette Colbert this kind of lesson about, you know, being a woman and you know how she should address the white woman's love interest. Meanwhile, she's not understanding her own daughter's you know, predicament as a young woman, you know, wanting to have it all, right? You know, so she's, you know, kind of playing that role. So that was just one of the things, but it was just for a moment, right? And again, you know, it's my fan cap and my scholar cap that I'm constantly turning, you know, back and forth, right? But I really do appreciate, you know, what you were saying, because the thing with Reggae John
Page,
you know,
I looked him up. Reggae John Page.
Reggae John Page, right. One of the things that is so, you know, I think spot on about the critique, but also me stepping back and saying, he's a fine man. Of course, people want to look at him, right? You know, so that there is that kind of titillation that, you know, that Shondaland for sure provides. It's one of the ways in which they are able to kind of engage the audience. But absolutely, you know, the Black male body on display, you know, the Black buck, and again, one of the things that's interesting about this piece is how Peggy really is kind of evocative of, and I think is playing Ida B. Wells, you know, as she's coming, you know, of age, right? Who's a journalist and, you know, who has her own sense of power and agency. And I love what you were saying too, Reva, about the about the the fact that Peggy seems to have much more agency and much more power and much more of a sense of a story arc that's more developed. I think it's really important, and it may have to do again with that lockdown period and the ability for these Black scholars to bring a fuller knowledge of that Black history. But the one last thing I wanted to say in this regard was, we're talking about how little we as a society and us as African Americans during Black History Month, oh yeah, happy Black History Month, by the way, don't get to know our own history. I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I didn't know that Terrell Junior High School and Dunbar High were named for these Black people because they didn't teach Black history in my schools, right? So I'm living with these living monuments, right? Terrell is named after Mary Church Terrell, a woman abolitionist and suffragist, a part of started this women's the women's club, Black Women's Club. And, it's all about, again, that talented 10th that is problematic on the one hand, but really speaks to what you guys were talking about earlier. How Black people on the one hand are up from slavery, as Booker T. Washington's autobiography was addressing. And then W.E.B. Du Bois's, the soul of Black folk kind of counters that narrative, right, with this idea of Black thinkers, not just, Black agriculture workers or Black, tradesmen. So there's this whole kind of, diversity of Black thought and Black upward mobility and philosophies that really, I think, this piece kind of gives us a little bit of an entree into, for us to find out more.
No, absolutely. It's a sneak preview into that world, Reggie. But what do you think? Because some of the articles that we both have read are saying that Danae Benton is upstaging Marion. Christina Baranski, I think, is the actress that plays Marion. Is that going to be a problem? Because although we want Peggy to succeed, but if Peggy succeeds too much, we know the kinds of problems that can create as well.
It probably will be a problem because that's a problem today in society. Here are a couple of important things. Is that when they hired Black writers, and in the pieces that we read, those Black writers said, you know what? They didn't hire me to write just about Peggy Sue.
Right.
Peggy Scott, excuse me. They didn't hire me just for that. So this is really important. And the reason it's important is because they are also writing about everybody. See, what we think, and I want to make this point, what we think is that when we get diversity, that we just going to get these people and we're going to push them off into the diversity corner. So you just write about Peggy Scott and we'll see about what happens. I think that kind of agency will balance itself out with the other writers, is that they know that during that time she can't supersede the white girl. I mean, but she can be her equal. She can be her equal, and I think that's at least seems to be the road in which they're going. I do want to say that I think we have to be careful here. Is that it's so funny listening to a criticism when we read those articles, listen to criticism about Amos and Andy and about Julia and about the Cosby Show. I think we have to be careful to recognize that I want to see a beautiful Black woman. I want to see a beautiful Black man. So when we start talking about, oh, let's not show that. No, let's show them in all of their glory as opposed to just that. So at some point, I'm curious when people are going to stop saying, okay, the naked Black dude that we just saw is the trope of, we're just using his body and we're just showing him for his body. Can we never show the dude for his body? I want to see that too.
And I think the answer, you've already given us the answer. And the answer is we've got to show more bodies. We've got to show more stories. And so it doesn't become an anomaly. It doesn't feel like objectification, because when we see white bodies every day, all day on TV and in film, we don't have that same impression. So when we start to see more stories where the Black body is not being used as an objective symbol of the racist hatred that we know to be true about how Black bodies have been used, but we're showing it in all its glory and its beauty. And yes, Dr. Everett and I and women across this country want to see those Black bodies. Okay, I'm running out of time. I've got to ask you guys this real quickly. The dad, Mr. Scott, kind of a villainous character. What do you think about his portrayal as a Black man? He's affluent, he's has his own business. He's obviously established himself in this Brooklyn community. Is he too mean, too nasty of a dad?
Let me take it first, so Dr.
Okay.
Everett
All right,
can
go
end.
ahead.
So Dr. Everett can end, because since it's about a Black man, I'm going to say that
good point.
it's a little bit problematic for me, because I want to see a Black man that seems to be loving. I want to see a Black man that seems to love that loves their child in a different kind of way. However, it is true. We got Black daddies like this who's saying, look, I gotta save you from yourself. I didn't work for all of this stuff to allow you to just fall to the trappings of life. Is that we've made it to a certain degree. So on the one sense, I want to see something else. But in the other sense, I'm like, is this so far-fetched that it's not true? So come on, people, let's not get too critical. That's good. So maybe we'll see another family where we'll see a father that's a little bit different. If not, we can't criticize this for that. I mean, it is true. We have fathers like that.
Okay, no, you're right. Good point. Well taken. We definitely have a lot of fathers like that try to control the lives of their children and who are very stoic and to the point of even being a little mean at times, show their love differently. Let's call it that. So what do you think, Dr. Everett, of the dad?
Yeah, well, I really do think that, Reggie is onto something and really makes the point. But just one quick correction. Marion is played by Meryl Streep's daughter. Anyway, the other thing that I wanted to say is what I love about what Reggie was saying is that we do, have the reality of what Black family dynamics, can be. But again, we don't essentialize, because there are not all Black dads or dark-skinned Black dads, are these tyrannical figures. But it's coming from a place of love. And also what I think they were trying to do, or what I read from it, was a kind of intergenerational struggle too. And he wants to pass his pharmacy on to his daughter, as he said, to take it over and build wealth and all that. But with Madam C.J. Walker, you can see how one generation makes the wealth and the other spends it, right? So that's not always a guarantee. But I do think that I saw a trailer where the actor playing the dad was talking about that. And he said, the father is trying to protect his daughter, in a way, and he's also someone who is not used to emoting and sharing emotions. So how can he impart those complex feelings to his daughter while also knowing that Black wealth is precarious and that you can have it today and it's gone tomorrow. So, he's really looking at the long game and having that protective, a dad thing going on. So, I agree with everything that Reggie was saying, while at the same time, kind of understanding from a historical lens that he's negotiating Black macroaggressions, microaggressions, in this new Negro, new woman, Black Renaissance era that's fraught, with all these contradictions. So, I think it was just great how, this show evokes so much. Oh, one last thing. I was thinking about, the line we were saying where, Peggy can't outshine Marion. I do think that the producers did a great job of easing into Peggy's story so as to avoid that very upstaging problematic, right? So that we don't really get to Peggy's story until episode 3 a little bit, and then episode 4, they flesh it out a little bit more, and then they kind of reel it in a little bit more in 5, but they also have have much more of Peggy there. So I think they're doing a good job of balancing that, as Reggie was saying. You can't have that kind of Black person taking over the narrative, but they can come closer to equality, or what I would like to call another buddy film, a woman's buddy film, because that's
that's a great way. And you're right. I correct myself. It's Louisa Jacobson who's playing
right, Meryl Streep's daughter. Yeah.
Yes, and she's Meryl Streep's daughter, and she's doing an outstanding job.
I confess,
as well. And I love the thought, and maybe Sally and Sonia will hear us. Yes, a budding relationship, girl love story, as we have seen in so many, sitcoms, rom-coms. We see these relationships between women where they form this incredible bond, and I think that's what we're going to see. Hopefully, as the episodes continue to drop. Now, I am mad, Reggie, because HBO does not do the Netflix thing. They have not dropped the whole season, so you've got to tune in every Monday. So we just watched episode 5 last night. There's 5 more to go in this season. The series is so successful, it's already been picked up for a season 2. So we know there will be more stories of Peggy and Marion and the Russells and the other families in New York.
And Ryans
about these families. So tune in every Monday, get your episode, get your feel on this great series. Thank you, Reggie. Thank you, Dr. Everett.
My pleasure.
Great conversation. Everyone that has not seen this series, you got to go to HBO Max. It's streamed. You can catch up really quickly on all 5.
And Black Twitter.
Black Twitter for the commentary, for the real commentary about these characters. So glad that we are watching this in Black History Month and celebrating Black excellence in this month. And thanks for both of you for helping us understand this period. Again, Dr. Everett's book is Returning the Gaze, A Genealogy of Black Film Criticism, 1990 to 1949. Make sure you check out her book. And she has lots of other books when you Google her and go to her Amazon page. Be well, my friends.
Thank you. Great pleasure. Bye, Reggie.
Bye-bye.
I want to thank all of my guests this morning for this enlightening conversation about this great series called The Gilded Age. And thanks to all of you for joining me. Make sure you check this out if you haven't watched anything else during this month, Black History Month. This is a show. It's got intrigue. It's got sex. It's got intimacy. It's got betrayal. It's got everything to make a good season. And it has a fantastic storyline of a prominent Black family in Brooklyn, New York. And if you didn't know that there are affluent Blacks living after Emancipation Proclamation, coming out of slavery, this is one show that will educate you on that history. Just some words to live by before I get out. Representation matters. If you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it is part of a tree. Know your history, y'all. I'm out. Be safe out there. Wear your mask, get your booster shot, and remember, we're all in this together.